This is an introduction to propaganda, the first book I'm going to be covering in a series on, propaganda. It was written by Edward Bernays and initially published in 1928. This book is a great starting point to understanding the nature of the modern world. And what I mean by that is, this book was published about 100 years ago when the mass communications market consisted primarily of newspapers and magazines. And over the last 100 years, through radio, television, internet, social media, etc., we can see the rise of things like consumerism and all kinds of other ideologies that have been promoted by mass media. Again, the nature of the modern world is derived directly from the message that has been delivered over the last 100 years. Now, this is a short and easy read. It's written in very common language. Anyone can easily understand it. The only real difficulty, I would say, is in accepting and digesting what I can only inadequately describe as the sinister implications of this work. Now, it should be noted that while this book is at the foundation of a much larger body of work that we will be exploring in the coming months, it is not the first, nor is it alone in prescribing the manipulation of the masses. Other authors and works, many even predating this one, include people like Poison Ivy Lee. He was a principal competitor to Bernays and the originator of modern crisis communications. We see modern crisis communications employed today when politicians get up on stage and say things like, never let a crisis go to waste. When COVID hit, there was a lot of talk like this. The Great Reset, Build Back Better. Lots of people said there was an opportunity in COVID to restructure the world, whether it be people fighting climate change or inequity, all sorts of things. Work from home was another way that the world has been somewhat reshaped by the COVID crisis. Now, Ivy Lee's real claim to fame was that he was employed by the Rockefellers to diffuse the public outrage after the Ludlow Massacre, which was a coal miner strike when the police were called in, riots ensued, and 21 people lost their lives. After this, he was tasked to create a more humanized portrayal of John D. Rockefeller Jr. And again, we can see a parallel to this today in the modern world when someone like Bill Gates rebrands himself from this 1990s, early 2000s era monopolist into this philanthropist, grandfather figure who wants to save the world nowadays. Another early propagandist was George Creel. He was the head of the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, which was a propaganda organization created by President Wilson during World War I. Now, interestingly here, Bernays, the author of the work we're going to be covering now, worked under Creel. This is where Bernays pretty well cut his teeth learning about propaganda. Now, Creel himself was ostensibly anti-censorship, but under his direction, he censored a lot of dangerous and unfavorable news about the war. Again, this is a theme we'll see over and over again, where these people claim one thing, anti-censorship, and then they turn around and they engage in explicit censorship. Now, by the end of World War I, the CPI was regarded as the greatest public relations effort in history. And another side note here, public relations and propaganda are literally the same thing. In these lectures, if you hear me say one or the other, again, I mean literally the same thing. After propaganda got its deservedly bad name, in typical propagandist fashion, they simply rebranded as public relations. And one other example of a contemporary of Bernays was a man by the name of Walter Lippmann. In one of his books, Public Opinion, from 1922, Lippmann called for a government propaganda machine to lead the bewildered masses. He was a proponent of an elite ruling class that would guide the nation. And again, we can see in modern times that not only are most nations guided by this elite ruling class, it has grown into supranational organizations controlling multiple nations. So, for example, we had the League of Nations, which became the United Nations. We have organizations like NATO or the BRICS or the European Union. In many cases, these people are unelected and they're strongly influencing many nations. And then there are other, even maybe less well-known groups like the World Economic Forum, the Bilderberg Group at Davos, the Council on Foreign Relations. The list really goes on and on. There's a lot of these so-called or self-proclaimed elites that have enormous influence. Now, again, later in life, Lippmann would change his opinions, and he thought that the masses would be able to overcome the complexities of modern life. Again, I think that in such the same way that Bill Gates rebranded himself, and how George Creel said he was anti-censorship but then censored, I think Lippmann was basically covering his ass, saying that, oh yeah, now that I'm at the end of my life, I did all this damage, I spent my entire adult career studying propaganda, now I'm simply going to flip at the very end, I would imagine, to try to give himself a better representation posthumously. Now, on this ability of people to handle themselves, he debated John Dewey, and any of the older listeners here might recognize the name Dewey from the Dewey Decimal System. He's another very interesting character. He was instrumental in creating the K-12 education system based roughly on the Prussian education system, but that's a topic for another day. Now, all of these men, they're interesting in their own regard, but we do have to start somewhere, and I think that the simplicity and directness that this book, Propaganda, it offers a very respectable jumping off point. Now, I would encourage everyone interested to read this work for yourself, and then use these forthcoming lectures as a supplement to understanding. But I also realize that many people simply don't have the time to dive into these works. So I will do my best to present an adequate condensation of the material. Now, that said, there are 6 books that I plan on covering for now. And if you're going to read any of them, this is the book you want to read. It truly is short and easy. I think it's 150 or 60 pages. Again, written in very common language. Each chapter is laid out like what we would call today a case study. And the simplicity of how he went about manipulating people, because, again, he only had access to things like newspapers and magazines. There wasn't all of these more modern channels of communication. Now, I would expect that there are probably 2 types of people that might be listening to this now. The first would be the so-called conspiracy theorists, who will likely find a lot of confirmation in what they have already suspected. The second group might be those who are starting to finally see the cracks in the mainstream, or maybe more accurately called legacy media. Now, if you fall into this latter category, much of what we will be covering might not be particularly easy to swallow. But I assure you that the language in these books, and that I'll use direct quotes in the lectures, it will leave little to the imagination. People like Bernays and his followers have written extensively about how they feel for the masses, and needless to say, the word disdain falls quite short. I'd also like to take a moment real quick to point out that the term conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorist is generally used as a pejorative, and when used this way, it's often accompanied by some kind of outlandish claims, like, oh, you believe that the World Economic Forum has unnecessary influence, therefore you must believe the earth is flat, or you believe in Bigfoot, or other nonsense. Now, these are generally ad hominem attacks, where you attack one's character and not their argument, and it also tries to engage in poisoning the well, a fallacy where you conflate something that might be a reasonable argument and an unreasonable argument to try to drag down the reasonable argument. Now, I think these sort of attacks are losing power as more corruption is seen, and obviously seen, among the ruling class, and with the ability of the internet, which in and of itself is a double-edged sword, mass media, writ large, but it at least can cut both ways. 100 years ago, heck, even 20 years ago, someone like me wouldn't have been able to reach an audience like you. Now, I am a self-proclaimed conspiracy theorist, and I have one very simple belief, a lens by which I view the world. There exists a class of people, the so-called elite, that have wealth, power, and influence. And these people work together with other wealthy, powerful, and influential people to both maintain and advance their wealth, power, and influence. It really is, I believe, as simple as that. We can see this in our day-to-day lives. when you're in school, there might be cliques where you have your jocks and your nerds, etc. And at work, you might have the HR department kind of hangs out together, and you've got the engineers that hang out together, etc. The difference being, when you're in school or at work, these people don't really have a lot of wealth, power, or influence. Maybe they can locally influence, very locally influence, like within inside the school or organization. But when you get to the national level, or you get to the global level, and again, you see people like, let's say, Bill Gates, or Elon Musk, or Klaus Schwab. These people have like enormous wealth, power, and influence. And so they can literally throw money at problems to advance whatever their agenda might be. And I'm not saying it's necessarily always a bad agenda, but it is giving them more power than I think any individuals or small group of individuals should have. Now, I think there are two quotes that we might find useful to keep in the back of your mind as you listen to these lectures or read the work. The first is, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Now, I don't think this is completely backwards. It's probably pretty reasonable that if your neighbor does something, they probably just did it by accident and not maliciously. But I also see that many times people will make an argument that a corporation or government is so stupid, but when we see these organizations making the same quote-unquote mistakes over and over again, should we at least not consider that feigning ignorance would be a useful tactic to hide one's malicious intent? One example of this might be the United States monetary policy. Everyone I know agrees that this idea of printing money and growing the national debt to ridiculous levels is stupid. But the people that are doing this, printing the money and influencing these policies, they are reaping tremendous rewards. The stupid policies that have failed over and over again yet continue to be repeated. Don't think for 1 second that these people, we might call them banksters, don't know exactly what they're doing. They're enriching themselves at the expense of everyone else, suffering via price inflation. Now, another sillier example. If I were to tell you that I was going to design a new Super Soaker water gun, and then I go off into my workshop to build it, and when I return, pull the trigger to display what I've built, and it doesn't produce water, it actually produces a giant fireball. No one would say, "Oh, you're so stupid, you tried to build a water gun, you failed, and accidentally built a flamethrower." It's not stupidity, it was a lie. From the word go, I lied, I knew what I was doing. You can't make that kind of a mistake. Now, a more concrete example of having the complete opposite of the stated intended policies is, let's say, the war on drugs. In the United States, for the last 50 or 60 years, we see that there are more drugs on the streets than ever, more overdoses than ever, more deaths than ever, higher profits for the cartels. It goes on and on. And similarly, we might have the war on poverty, where we have more homeless people now than ever before. Now, in my opinion, you would have to kind of be a fool to think that these, and there are countless other examples of things getting worse while the leaders keep mouthing platitudes that they're doing the best to solve these problems. Again, you would have to be a fool to see that this isn't direct malice. If it truly was ignorance and these people didn't know what they were doing, every now and then the odds would be that something would randomly go in our favor. But it seems that, like I said, the war on drugs, for 50 or 60 years, every single policy relating to that has led to worse and worse drug use. Now, the other quote is from Ian Fleming of James Bond fame. He said, "Once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, and the third time is enemy action." I think this dovetails perfectly in what I was just saying before. If you try to solve a problem once and you fail, okay, you're not going to get it right the first time every time. And maybe even there's a good reason to double down and try the same solution a second time for whatever reason. But once we get to that third time, you're trying the same solution for the third time, I think then we can start to think that it's enemy action. It's malicious behavior. And I think taken together, these two quotes, with the litany of examples of how things are getting worse, I think we can assume at this point that it's enemy action and malice when we try to understand why various things happen in our day-to-day political world. So now with all that out of the way, we can finally get started with Propaganda, written by Edward Bernays and initially published in 1928. If you're listening to this on YouTube or Rumble or any of the other video platforms, down in the description there will be links to all of the other chapters. If you've found this somewhere else and there's no show notes, you can go to my website, howtoeatanelephant.xyz, and click on the main course link or the propaganda link, and it will take you to essentially a syllabus of what everything we're going to be covering. It'll include all the show notes and probably direct links to the downloads. All right, thank you for your time and attention, and I hope you enjoy this coming lecture.